Recently, the Palm Springs Kiwanis Club had another great speaker. Let's listen in.
When I first got involved with the White House, I had just turned 18. So I just got out of high school, and a little bit of background on why and how I was ever connected to the White House. I'm from Louisiana, born and raised, and the infamous Long family. Huey Long, of course it wasn't Huey. Huey was assassinated long before me, but he was assassinated in 1937. But his brother, Russell Long, was a senator. And Russell's son went to school with me. And so when we finished high school, the senator wanted him to come back to Washington because he had allowed him to stay back in Louisiana. So this is a good mic. Very good. So am I speaking too loud?
No, you can be louder if you will.
Okay. So the short version of that is I asked my grandmother, who raised me as a kid, if I could go to Washington, D.C. with Earl. He wanted me to go back with him because he didn't want to leave Louisiana either. And so I asked her, and she said, well, if you have a job. And I knew nothing of the ways of politics, of course. But his father wrote me a letter to whom it may concern. I still have the letter. And I went to Washington and rode the Greyhound bus. This was in 1962. Rode the Greyhound bus back and went after a few days. My sister was living in Washington. She was in the Army, and she was a secretary in McNamara's office. He was Secretary of Defense at that time. And so stayed with her the first few nights. Within a day or two, went over to the Capitol and gave my letter to the senator's staff in the Capitol. And within a very short time, started to work in the Speaker's office. John McCormick was Speaker of the House. And all of you hopefully are old enough to remember John McCormick. And his assistant, Martin Swag, Dr. Martin Swag, who I thought was an old man, but I'm sure now he was probably about 30, but he seemed old to me since I was only 18. And I started to work in the Speaker's office, and my job was to get in there at 5:30 every morning and put out the Washington Post, or the Washington Post, New York Times, and the Wall Street Journal on the Speaker's desk, make his coffee and tea, and have it all prepared when he came in. He came in about 6 o'clock every morning. And it was little known that the Kennedy brothers, the president and Robert and Ted Kennedy, met with the Speaker in his office secretly once a month. And so when they were going to come, there was a little bit more to do. And the Speaker, or the Dr. Swag, the assistant to the Speaker, said to me one day, the president and his brothers are coming, and I want you to meet them. And I remember the horrified feeling I had about I could never imagine meeting a president, and particularly Kennedy. Even in that time period, he was loved by many, hated by some too, especially Southerners and Catholic people. Southerners that were Christian and not Catholic, they were scared of Kennedy because he was Catholic. They're sure he was going to rule the world and take over. Anyway, that's an aside. But this particular day came, and Dr. Swag said, okay, let's go in. They had been there a short time. They came obviously in the back way. And so he took me in, and I still can remember how extraordinarily afraid I was to meet them, to say anything. And I said to Dr. Swag, I said, what do I say? And he said, you don't have to say anything but hello. And he said, they'll probably ask you something. And that's what scared me, of course. So anyway, it was a very brief and very interesting, because to be in the presence of President Kennedy was an unbelievable, probably the most unbelievable experience I've ever had. So that was over. A very short time later, Evelyn Lincoln was President Kennedy's secretary, and she heard through Dr. Swag that I was a very fast typist. I had won the state contest in Louisiana my senior year, junior year probably, and I could type on a standard typewriter as fast as people could take dictation. So I could type as the secretary or as the president spoke. And so Mrs. Lincoln loved the sound of that. So she asked that I come over to the White House to interview, and I did, and took a typing test. And I remember they asked if how soon I could come to work. And again, being ignorant of the whole system, I said, well, I'll have to check with my boss in the Speaker's office and see, knowing that if the president wants you, you don't have to ask anybody. But it was a wonderful experience, and I went, within a few weeks, within a week, I went to the White House, and I was assigned to Mrs. Lincoln. And my time there was, that was in January of 62. So it was, the full year passed before the assassination. But that Dallas trip came up in November of 63. And back then, and I think it still happens this way, that when the president's going to take a trip outside Washington, and they take the whole presidential staff, so to speak, the immediate staff. I was clerical staff. There were 4 clerical people that went on all the trips with him to do the typing. And so it was 2 women and myself, and we were in the very back part of Air Force One. And that, in those days, that was a Boeing 727. 707? So by today's standards, of course, it's a tiny plane. There was probably 50 or 60 staff people on the plane with President Kennedy and Mrs. Kennedy. And so they select staff as much as they can based on where the staff is from. So I'm from Louisiana, so they thought kind of be good to ask people that's from the South to go down there. And I remember, even as young as I was, that I was fearful of him going to Texas. I remember thinking, knowing Southerners, being one myself, that he wasn't well liked. So I was afraid of that, It was kind of like when President Obama was elected. I was always worried so much that something would happen to him. Thank goodness it didn't for 8 years, But with Kennedy, well, you know the history. Several incidents had occurred in Dallas prior to his going there. So on that day, we had flown first to Houston and then up to Dallas, or to Fort Worth, and spent the night in Fort Worth. And as a clerk, or just as a staff person, we weren't certainly not around the first family other than going and coming. And if there was a need for my typing or clerical skills, Mrs. Lincoln told me what to do. And we had a room set up for the staff. And on this particular trip, we flew then from Fort Worth that morning of the 22nd over to Dallas, and it was interesting. The 2 women that worked with me in the little clerical pool, it was no bigger than a 10 by 10 little room with 3 typewriters on typing stands is all we had. No computers, of course. In fact, we had 1 manual typewriter. I preferred manual typewriter then. And they had a Selectric, the one that...
Excuse me, what kind of
Typewriter?
What did you use?
I used an Underwood. Yeah.
I know about typewriters.
Oh yeah, I love the Underwood. No, that's okay. And then we did have a Selectric, the one with the ball on it that went back and forth. We had one of those. But that was always frustrating to me because I type fast enough, and I'm not boasting, I just happen to have a gift of a fast typist. But I didn't like the Selectric because you had to wait for the ball to go back when you threw the carriage or went to another line. My typing speed when I won the contest in Louisiana was 145 words a minute on a 35-minute time writing with no errors. You were 150?
No, I thought you would be.
Oh, yeah. So, yeah, it worked for that for sure. Obviously, as you know, at 72 years old, I don't type that fast anymore. I don't type anywhere close to that. But that day we got to Dallas, and I well remember the president and Mrs. Kennedy walking past us because we're in the tail section of the plane, and they went out the back door to get the car and everything to go on the parade. I can't say I predicted gloom or something happening, but I certainly, again, it was that fear that we had about something happening anyway. And we all discussed once they left the plane that they were going into something very dangerous. So many people, the parade, that kind of thing. And the president didn't want the top on the limousine either. So about half hour, 45 minutes after they left the plane, the Secret Service, or a group of Secret Service people, stay on the plane, obviously to guard the plane, and we were just working, and we could hear the motorcade and talk between the agents, and we heard the first recognized when the Secret Service jumped on the plane, came on the plane, and started lowering all the blinds on the windows, and we just saw the commotion and knew something was going on, and they said there had been a shooting near the parade. And I even remember Secret Service agents talking about the grassy knoll that you've all read about and heard about, and seeing men on the grassy knoll. I always found it interesting that was certainly talked about by the conspiracy theorists, but it never got much publicity or never was talked about a great deal. I still tend to believe there is a conspiracy out there. I don't think we'll ever know. And too many people now are dead that would ever have any possibility of knowing anything. Many people that have worked with me and listened to me talk about this think that I'm maybe the last person that was still alive that was on Air Force One that day. I don't know that. Can't prove that. And it doesn't even matter.
You were pretty young.
I was 18, yeah. So, yeah. So, who knows? But that was the lead up to, then after the assassination, they all came back to the plane. We were moved over to Air Force Two, Johnson's plane, and Johnson, the new president, came over to Air Force One, and we didn't move. We left Air Force One and moved to Air Force Two, and flew back to Washington that way. I recollect that we left Dallas before the president did, because they did the swearing in and all that stuff. And when we got to Washington, we went straight to the White House and didn't leave for about 3 days. We slept on cots in the basement below the Oval Office because obviously you can imagine how busy and what a unbelievable repertoire of things going on in the White House. Not only because of the assassination, but Johnson's people still there, Mrs. Kennedy still there, the Kennedys resenting the Johnsons, and I think blaming them or thinking they probably were part of it. Robert Kennedy was furious. He was a very angry man. And we were just like little flies on the wall. We just observed everything. In the White House, and I bet it's that way today. Well, who knows what this is today in the White House, but back then, the staff knew the unwritten rule was you spoke to the first family only when spoken to. You didn't say good morning or anything unless they spoke to you, which is kind of kept you from being too obtrusive to the...
So you were, when the motorcade was happening, you were on the plane?
On the plane, on Air Force One. And so, yeah, after he went to the hospital and they declared him dead, it was a bit after that we moved from Air Force One to the Vice President's plane. But that was the scenario up to that point. I never left the White House. I, for about a month, went to McNamara's office in the Pentagon as a typist, always. And within maybe not even a month, Mrs. Lincoln had obviously talked to Johnson's secretary, whose name I don't even remember, but she called me back. So I went back to the Johnsons, and I was at the Johnsons until 1965, so 2 years. And my experience with the Johnsons was very different. If I had not known the Kennedys as president, it wouldn't have affected me so much, but it was hard for me to adjust to the Johnson administration. He was a very different type president, and he was salty and didn't have much class or sophistication and didn't care. That's the good thing, I guess. So, but I can jump back before the assassination and talk about my time in the White House. I enjoyed going to work every day, even though we worked very long days, always 10, 12, 15 hours, sometimes stayed overnight. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, I was very involved in typing the speeches and the correspondence, because the president would dictate to Mrs. Lincoln. I would type, or sometimes I would sit in the Oval Office and type what he was saying. Was a mouse in the corner, had no role, no frontage at all. Just sit back there and never. And if there was a question, she asked the questions. I didn't. I never stopped him and said I didn't get that or anything like that. You know? But he was a wonderful man, just kind and caring. You know, he never showed any particular attention to me, the typist, but he was a good person. All the big staff people around him loved him, you know, and he was kind. I never saw him. He showed some anger and frustration with Khrushchev when the Cuban Missile Crisis was going on, and he expressed himself. And back in those days, we all had top secret clearance, so we weren't allowed to ever. I never talked to any of my friends. Closest friend, my sister, never, ever. I was scared to death to say anything that I would get in trouble for. So we never revealed the comments that were spoken by the president or the vice president. So, but Mrs. Kennedy was wonderful. You know, I'm sure you've read, she was a chain smoker. But, yeah, smoked nonstop, but never photographed.
That's right. Never.
And that was an understanding, she had with the press. It's interesting, in those days, the press honored those kinds of things, you know.
As they did with FDR.
Yes, wouldn't photograph him, or he didn't like to be photographed in his chair. And that was a big thing. Not a secret, it's just that he didn't want
You know,
to be
of the
photographed.
40,000 photos of FDR at Hyde Park, only 2 of them
Showed
in the wheelchair.
in a wheelchair, yeah.
And those were taken by the family.
Yeah. But Mrs. Kennedy would go upstairs. She didn't smoke downstairs around the Oval Office where the staff was. But the reason I even mentioned that she smoked, she would go upstairs to the family quarters, and often kids were always around, John and Caroline, and she would often say to me, would you watch the kids? And that was always a treat. I loved that, to see the kids. And they were just normal kids running around everywhere. The president insisted they have full access to everything. Any meeting he was in, he said to Mrs. Lincoln, he said, well, you know, if the kids want to come in, that's fine. So I never saw any restrictions in terms of who the guest was of the president in the Oval Office with a meeting. I don't recall him ever having one that he said keep the kids out. Might have happened. I wouldn't have known, probably. But if you have any questions, I'll try to answer them.
Were you in meetings in the Oval Office, or when he had dignitaries in, were you taking notes? Were typewriter?
Yes, because but I was in a meeting one time when Winston Churchill was there.
Oh, really?
And that was a trip. I really was amazed at that. And Charles de Gaulle, he was in the White House many times. But I saw all of the world leaders that came to his funeral. And the second or third night before the actual funeral, they had not a reception, but a receiving line in the state dining room for all the staff people, everybody on the White House staff, to go through and meet the leaders. No conversation, you just went through, they announced our name as we walked up to the line and then walked down. Everybody, Winston Churchill, Charles de Gaulle, Queen Elizabeth, well, I can't take them all, but you know that back in those days who they all were. But it was overwhelming. I think I was most affected by meeting the Queen because I didn't know what to say or do or anything, and how to curtsy or how to anything. They gave us some information. They gave us guidance, you know.
You were just a kid, and she was young.
She was still young then. Yeah.
Did you guys record, did they use tape recorders for meetings then?
Yes. Not to the extent that Nixon did, of course. They hadn't installed that whole system then. But not too much, no.
Did they have a secretary doing shorthand, taking notes while you were typing?
Oh, yes. Evelyn always took notes.
Did they have a stenographer machine going?
She did. There was a woman they would have. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, they had a stenographer that came in and did the, what do you call it, for court recording type thing. That type thing, yeah. So, yes.
How did they break the news to you that Kennedy died, and what was the among the people?
Well, we were on the plane.
Silence, or
Oh, yes. Crying, a lot of sobbing.
must have been scared to death?
Oh, scared. That was a good word. I remember thinking, we can't continue. This country can't continue. This is it. And then you wonder, what was the future? How, if we have no president? We didn't even consider, the Kennedy people at that time didn't even consider Johnson president, even though he was sworn in. The staff really resented the Johnson family.
Led a very interesting life. Thank you.
Thank you. I never forget how valuable it is to me that I met President Kennedy, especially. Thank you guys very much.
For more, go to KiwanisPalmSprings.org.